Okay, guys. Hello and welcome to our exclusive Ask Me Anything webinar. My name is Marcin Łukasik, and today I'm going to be your host. Now, please let me introduce my guests: Raghu Devarakonda, Chief Architect at Cloud Casa, Bobby Dare, Product Manager at Cloud Casa as well. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Hi, Marcin. Thank you.
Hi. We're good. Welcome, everybody.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Today we have some good stuff. Velero Backup Essentials, choosing what works best for you. It's today's webinar's topic. Raghu, I remember when we had that conversation a while ago, I asked you about that specific topic. Why do you even want to latch onto that? And you told me, people are talking. There are like a lot of questions on different Velero forums here and there. So my question is, why choosing the right Kubernetes backup is such a burning and very common issue nowadays among so many people?
Right, that's a good question, and it's a good way to start this webinar. I mean, until some time back, Kubernetes was mostly known for running stateless workloads, and people really didn't care much about the backup at that time. I mean, they say if something happens to anything on the cluster, we are simply going to recreate that and just create all the resources from our Git repo, right? No problem. That was okay. That worked as long as you're running the stateless workloads, but that's not the case anymore. People are running stateful workloads in Kubernetes clusters in production. I mean, that's been very clear from various sources, from CNCF surveys, from our own customer interactions, and from all the questions that we see in Velero Slack, Velero GitHub, all the forums. People are asking more and more about how do we protect the data in the persistent volumes. And so it's very clear that stateful workloads such as databases, they are being run on Kubernetes. And once you do that, backup of the data in persistent volumes is super important, right? Like any other case, like virtual machines, physical machines, now it becomes very important to backup. And that is why it is important to understand how to do the backup of persistent volumes, what tools to choose, and assuming you are using Velero, which most people do today, which particular type of Velero backup is good for you, and that is the very topic of this webinar.
That's great. I believe that now, Raghu, you're going to explain us and show us which type of Velero backup should we choose. So listen, man, take it away. And before you do that, after your presentation and demonstration, we're going to have some moment for a few questions from the audience. So guys, if you like to ask anything, please drop your questions in the comment section. And Raghu, take it away, buddy.
Right. Thank you, Marcin. Hi, everyone. My name is Raghuram Devarakonda. I'm Chief Architect of Cloud Casa. So before I jump into this webinar itself, I just want to take a quick minute or two to talk about Cloud Casa, right? Okay, so Cloud Casa is a Kubernetes. Cloud Casa is a product for Kubernetes data backup. We've been doing this for a few years now, so we have a good experience on what goes into the Kubernetes backup, and based on all our interactions with users and customers. And sometime this year, we also released a second service, which we called Cloud Casa for Velero, because we noticed that a lot of people are using Velero. They're happy with it, even though there are some challenges with using Velero. For example, if you have more than, let's say, 5 clusters running Velero, right? It's not easy to monitor what's going on. It's not easy to manage that. So we heard that. And so we released this service called Cloud Casa for Velero. Using that, you can manage and monitor all your Velero installations from a single place from Cloud Casa UI, right? At a single glance, you can tell what's going on with your setup. And finally, we also have what is called Velero support plans. I mean, this works very similar to how the other open source support things work. If you have any questions about Velero, you can ask us. And if you sign up for this plan, we can immediately answer your questions from all our experts in the team. In fact, we are very active in Velero development. We contribute a lot of things. I mean, recently, for example, we contributed support for block PVs, which is a very important functionality. So we know how Velero works, and basically how to make changes and things like that. So if you have any questions, we can answer. And even if you want small changes made, we can make that for you. We can drive the process for you. So you will get all that functionality if you support for our Velero support plans. Okay, so with that introduction about Cloud Casa out of the way, I want to jump into the main topic of today's webinar. It's about Velero backup types. And again, those of you who probably frequent Velero Slack channels, basically you might have seen me answering questions, right? Almost every single day I answer few questions from users about Velero. So that kind of gave us an insight into what kind of typical problems people run into, especially those who are starting afresh with Velero, right? And one of that topic is what type of backup do I choose? Because Velero has a bunch of different types of backups. And even worse, sometimes people say, I'm trying to do the backup of persistent volume. I'm trying different ways, but whatever I do, Velero doesn't back up the PV. It only back up the resources. What am I doing wrong? So these kind of questions we see almost every single week. So I thought that this is a very good topic for our monthly series on Velero, right? We do have a series of webinars on Velero, and this is one topic that I want to cover today. The agenda for today's call, after a quick introduction, I'll cover all the different types here, snapshots, file system backups, and finally, we'll talk about the most recently introduced in the type snapshot data mover backups, right? This is introduced a couple of months back in 1.12. Again, just a quick disclaimer, I'm not going to basically cover very basic or introductory details about Velero. I kind of assume that you know how to install Velero and you know there's some topics like backup storage location and things like that. If you're really interested in getting some details about introductory level Velero, I recommend you watch one of the webinars that I have done a few months back. It's called Velero Introductory Webinar with Persistent Volumes. You can easily find that. And I recommend that you go through that as well, right? But for the purpose of this webinar itself, I kind of assume some knowledge, prior knowledge of Velero. Velero, as everybody knows, it's very, very popular open source Kubernetes backup tool. You can see that from various indicators, the number of Docker image pulls. I mean, it runs into millions, and probably by the last count, I think it's more than 100 million Docker image pulls of Velero image. So that kind of tells you how popular Velero is, right? And in the Velero Slack is very active. People, Velero GitHub issues are very active. And all of that points to the fact that majority of people in the Kubernetes space are using Velero, or at least giving Velero a try as their backup solution. And it does support various different support cases like you can do cluster migration, you can back up on one cluster, you can restore to an alternate cluster, you can use that for disaster recovery and things like that. You can even restore from, move things from one provider to another provider that is supported by Velero, right? And at the very high level, Velero can back up just the resources, the resource specs, or it can also back up the PV data. And for all practical purposes, people really are interested in backup of PV data. So most of the time in today's webinar, I'm going to focus on that aspect of Velero. All right, so let's begin with the most basic backup type that is supported by Velero, that what I would call the basic resource backups. In this type of the backup, so it's essentially the backup for all the resource specs, right? All the YAML specs, but Velero backs them up as JSON. But it essentially takes all the resources that you selected. You can select in various different ways, by namespaces, by labels. Even you can even select by specific resource types. You might want to back up only PVs and PVCs, pods, secrets, config maps, so you can give that list. And Velero will pick only those resources and get the spec of all those resources, bundles them up, and uploads them to the object store, right? In this webinar, I'm going to go back and forth between a couple of different ways of showing you things. We will go to the terminal. Here, if I want to show how to create, how to create backups, how to run backups, and things like that. For example, to create the this basic backup, right? So this is how I created in my own environment. So I'm using the storage location. This is the backup storage location I created. By the way, I'm going to use DigitalOcean Spaces as the object store for the purpose of webinar today. Here I'm explicitly saying I'm not interested in snapshots. I'm setting it to false. and I am not selecting any particular resource, which means that Velero is going to back up all the resources in all the namespaces on the cluster. I mean, I already ran this backup, right? So as you can see here, basic backup completed. And let's quickly go and see what is included in that, right? So describe details, basic backup. And now this is going to tell you exactly that is included in this backup. As you can see here, I'm including all the namespaces. I haven't excluded anything, right? So here you can see the full list. Essentially, Velero picked up all the resources on this cluster, right? And there are no snapshots, as you can see here. And I will also, I want to show you the Velero documentation in this regard. If you go to the Velero website and documentation, there is this page called resource filtering. This is talking about all the different ways that you can include or exclude different resources. So there are a lot of options. So I don't want to go through all of them in the interest of time, but you can easily check this page and it will tell you. So you have a lot of control on what resources to include, what resources to exclude, right? From this page, you can get all those details. But I do want to mention one quick thing though. So by default, Velero is not going to include all the cluster resources in the backup. It will include some cluster resources, essentially some of them which are needed for other resources in the selection. But other than that, it's not going to include everything unless you use one of these two options. You can, when you create the backup, you can use include cluster resources, or more recently introduced option, which gives you more control, include cluster scoped resources, right? With the latter option, you can explicitly set what cluster resources you want to include. But I would personally prefer the first one because I really want to include everything in my backup, right? If I want to select something, I want to do it at the restore time, I want to be more selective. But typically during the backup time, I really want to select as much as I can. And for that reason, I do recommend that you use include cluster resources when you create the backups. And by the way, when I'm showing this backup create commands, even though I'm saying Velero backup create, everything, all the options I talk about, they all apply to Velero schedules as well, right? So you can easily do Velero schedule create with the same options, and that will work. Okay, and this is the basic resource backups. I would also want to show what you will see on the object store, right? This is my, like I said, I'm using DigitalOcean Spaces. This is my bucket, and I'm using the prefix demo1. So all the files will be created under this prefix in the bucket. And Velero will create a folder called backups, and in that you see basic backup. And here you're going to see a bunch of compressed files, right? They are going to contain they contain the resource specs of various resources that you selected in this backup. All right, that is about resource backups. Again, it's very important to recognize here that PV data is not backup. This is only resource specs. No persistent volume data is going to be part of this type of the backup. And also another important point is this is the baseline for all the other types of backups. Everything else that I will talk about, the file system backup, the snapshots, or even the other recent backup, snapshot data mover backups, all of them are going to be done on top of this. So whatever backup type that you select is always going to include the resources selected, just like you have seen in the object store just now. So this will be there all the time. Whatever backup type you select, this is going to do. Velero is going to include all this information, but it will do more depending on the type. For example, if you're doing the snapshot type, Velero is going to take the snapshot of the PVs in addition to all the other resource specs, right, as I described. So now let's move on to the persistent volume data. And as I was talking about in the introduction, those days of running only the stateless workloads on Kubernetes clusters are long gone, right? People are running stateful workloads in production, all right? And CNCF has done a bunch of surveys, and huge percentage of respondents say we are running stateful workloads in production now on Kubernetes clusters, and which automatically means that you need to have a strategy for protecting your persistent volumes, right? I mean, this is no different from the old times when you were running applications in VMs or even physical machines. backup was a big deal. And same thing applies to Kubernetes. The moment you run the stateful workloads, you have to have a strategy on how would you protect persistent volumes, both from accidental deletion, the storage errors, or from the user errors, right? People can delete maybe some tables in the database, the logical errors, and things like that. So you need to have a backup strategy. And backup means pretty much, it means the backup of the persistent volume data. And for that, you have a bunch of options. So I'm going to cover all these snapshots, file system backups, and the snapshot data mover backups, right? So let's talk about snapshots, right? Because this is probably the easiest thing, easiest backup type. There are two types of snapshots that I will be talking about. One is CSI and the other, what I call the provider snapshots. CSI, for those of you who are not familiar with it, CSI is Container Storage Interface. That is the storage standard adopted on Kubernetes. It's very widely adopted now, and we can see that from all our customer interactions and everywhere based on the questions. Most of the persistent volumes these days are CSI persistent volumes, and that's a good thing. It's an accepted standard. The standard is evolving very fast. More and more operations are being added to, more and more interfaces are being added to this CSI spec. So it's a good thing that a lot of people are moving to it, right, or already moved to it. But unfortunately, there are still some gotchas that you need to be aware of, and I will be talking about that, right? And CSI spec supports the snapshot API, and for the CSI PVs, that's what I mean by CSI snapshots. Velero will be using those APIs to take the snapshot. The second type of what I call the provider snapshots, for the lack of better term, this is if you're not using CSI. For example, if your cluster is running in EKS and if you're using the EBS driver, right? To take the snapshot, you have to use the EBS APIs. And obviously, for that, you need code specific to the EBS. And that is done through the Velero plugins. So you need Velero AWS plugin, volume snapshotter plugin to take the snapshot. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because, like I said, majority of people these days are only using CSI. So let's get into more detail about the CSI snapshot. So what is involved here? So first of all, CSI installation is not a straightforward process. Unfortunately, it's not included in your vanilla Kubernetes installation. I mean, you probably are like you're in luck if your clusters are running in cloud providers like EKS, Google, or Azure, because they in most cases when you create the cluster, you're going to have this option CSI add-on, right? Something like that. So you just select that, and you're going to have the CSI installation done on your cluster. Nothing else needs to be done. But if that's not the case, if your clusters are running on-prem or if you're using providers which don't support this kind of add-on functionality, you really need to jump through some hoops to get the CSI up and working, right? That means you have to install the proper CSI driver. And not only that, there is a component called external snapshotter. So that is a platform component that is required for the CSI to work, but it's not included in vanilla Kubernetes, right? And the most important thing here is that you need to find the right version of the external snapshotter that works, that is compatible with the CSI driver. So we see this, again, people run into problems because either they forget to install the external snapshotter or they use the wrong version. So snapshots don't work. So we see this all the time from our customers as well as from Velero users. Now, to enable the Velero CSI functionality, when you install Velero, so you need to do two things. First of all, you need to pass this option, enable CSI, and also you need to include the CSI plugin, right? So I'll quickly go through my own Velero install command here. So I'm going to show here. So I have this enable CSI flag. And as you can see, I also included the Velero CSI plugin, right? One important point here to note is the version of the plugin. I mean, this applies to all the plugins, not just the CSI plugin. This is another area where people run into trouble because they do not use the right version of the plugin. So if you're using 1.12, you must use this CSI plugin, right? 0.6.0 at this point. And if you're using 1.11, at this moment, 0.51 CSI plugin is the latest version. So if you don't do that, Velero will not comply. The installation will be successful, But when you really do the backup, you will see mysterious errors, and it's always very difficult to debug at that point, right? So you have to make sure that you are using the right plugin versions when you install the CSI. All right. So there are more things that you need to do to get the CSS snapshots to work. One is you need to have the volume snapshot class, because when you create to create the PV snapshot, the way to do that is Velero creates a volume snapshot resource. That is the way to create a resource. And the external snapshotter is going to see this and then start the snapshot process, right? But even before that happens, you need to have the volume snapshot class for each CSI driver on your cluster. And not only that, you need to set this label on that volume snapshot class. For example, here I have, I'll show you that. So on my cluster, I have a single volume snapshot class. Again, this is the DigitalOcean cluster. And now you can see the label that I set on this, right? So you have to set this label. This is how Velero knows which volume snapshot class to use. Again, in 1.12, new features are introduced in this area. If you want a more advanced ways of specifying volume snapshot class, you can do. But for most purposes, you will probably have one volume snapshot class per CSI driver. So it's enough if you put this label on that volume snapshot class. Now, as I mentioned, if the CSI is not properly configured, you're going to see errors in Velero log saying, Velero basically times out after 10 minutes. It creates a snapshot request. It waits for 10 minutes, and if snapshot is not ready, it moves on. And most probable reason for that is some problem with the external snapshotter, either the version or the external snapshotter is not there itself, right? Okay, so before we go to provided snapshots, I do have a CSI backup done. So I'll show again details here, backup details. And I want to point out especially one thing here. So if you do the backup describe details on a CSI backup, you're going to see an entry like this, CSI volume snapshots. In my case, I have one persistent volume. So you're actually seeing one PV here. So if you have multiple, you're going to see all of them here, right? This is the snapshot details. So let's just quickly talk about provider snapshots and jump to the other backup types. And if you're not using CSI PVs, right? For example, EBS, you have to use this provider snapshots. And for that, you have to include the right plugin, the AWS plugin, for example, in this case. And then Velero will use that plugin to create the snapshot. The plugin itself is going to use that storage-specific or provider-specific APIs, right, to take the snapshot. It works very similar. Once the snapshot is taken, it's very similar to how CSS snapshots behave for all the other purposes, rest of the functionality. But again, we won't cover much about this. Now, there are some limitations that you should be aware of, right? Snapshots, you probably heard this, multiple people say this, right? Snapshots are not backups. I mean, they're good for certain things. You can keep few snapshots around for doing quick restores. Maybe you keep last 7 days or so if you want to really do a quick restore. But snapshots cannot be your full backup strategy. Now, why? Because snapshots are typically tied to your primary storage. And if something happens with your primary storage, not only you're going to lose that, you're also going to lose the snapshots. And that is bad, because this is precisely the time that you need your backups, when you lose your primary storage, right? And even if the snapshots are not very closely tied to the primary storage, for example, if you snapshot EBS volumes in EKS, it will move the data to S3, right? EBS snapshots are persisted in S3. But even then, there are a lot of limitations. For example, those EBS snapshots are tied to the region that the cluster is in. If the cluster is in US East 1, you cannot restore those snapshot backups into another region. And you definitely need that for disaster recovery, right? So for all these reasons, snapshots should not be your only backup strategy. They can be part of your backup strategy, but you should have other backups like file system backups and other backups as part of your strategy. That's very, very important. So that brings to the next file backup type, which is called file system backup. You do see this terminology FSB referred to in Velero documentation and other places. It's called file system backup. And what it does is it takes the persistent volume data and it moves that data to the object store. So when many people say backup, without saying anything else, this is what they mean. They mean the backup of the data from persistent volumes offsite, right, to object store or to some other place, something that is not closely tied to either the cluster or the region or the primary storage. And that's what most people mean by the backup, and that's what you really need for a real backups, right? And the way that this is done is Velero uses these two tools. Most of you might already be familiar with this. If not, they are Restic or Copia. They're independent tools. They're not really tied to Velero in any sense. Even you can use them on your Linux or Mac or Windows to back up your files to object store. So Velero just calls them on a persistent volume, and basically they take the data on persistent volume and put that in the object store. Now, the important thing is to get this functionality, you need to use this option, use node agent. Again, going back to my install command, you're going to see that use node agent, right? You need this option. So when you do this option, Velero is going to install a component called node agent. By the way, I just quickly want to point out that when I use kv command, that means I'm using kube control in Velero namespace. So if you see what is in Velero namespace, you see a daemon set called node agent here. And I have two nodes in this cluster, so you're going to see two parts, node agent parts, right? So you need this node agent for file system backup and even for the other type of the backup that I'm going to talk about. And one of the errors that we see is people forget to install the node agent, and they try to do the file system backup, and they come back and say, oh, Velero is not backing up the PVs. And one of the reasons is that you forget to install the node agent, right? So you need that. And also you can select which tool you want to use. I mean, by default, Velero switch you to using Copia. But for whatever reason, if you have to use Restic, you can easily select the uploader type option and set Restic, right? But I do want to mention that the new functionality, more and more functionality is being added in Velero for Copia, right? The Restic is not seeing new enhancements. So unless you have a genuine reason to stick with Velero, I highly recommend that you just use the default uploader type, which is Copia. And I also want to briefly talk about how these Restic or Copia work. They have this concept of backup repository, right? This backup repository is created in the object store in your bucket, and that is where all your backups go to. And whenever you run the backup, let's say of some PVs, so these tools are reading the data in the PV, and they're transferring the data to this backup repository only if required. If those blocks are already there in the backup repository, they don't need to transfer that data. So you are getting dedupe out of the box with these tools. And you can, Velero creates one backup repository per namespace. That means you are getting dedupe across the namespace, but I mean, within a namespace, right? But not across namespaces. So that's the design choice that Velero made. So let me quickly show the command here that you can use for, I think Velero has, right? So you can see these backup repositories, and you can see the repository name has the namespace included in that, right? So there's one backup repository, and I'm using Copia in all cases, so that's why you see Copia here, right? Now, so this is important point. Both these tools support dedupe. I briefly described what dedupe does. And again, for dedupe, important point to note is even though the tools transfer only the changed blocks, they still need to read all the data in the file, right? Without reading, they really do not know which data had changed. So if you have a big file with small changes, they still have to read the file and then back up whatever data had changed. I mean, this can probably improve. This will improve once we have a changed block tracking in Kubernetes, and Kubernetes data protection work group is actively working on that as we speak. And they support compression and they support encryption. So all the data in the backup repository is encrypted. And for encryption, Velero is actually going to use a hard-coded password that everybody knows this password because this is hard-coded. And this password is there in a secret called Velero repo credentials, right? So if you see secret here, so you see the secret. And inside the secret, there is a base64 encoded password. But I highly recommend that as soon as you install Velero, you should change that password to something else, right? All you need to do is to basically edit this secret and set the new password in base64 form. But you must do it before you run any backups, before a backup repository is created, right? If you do it after backup repository is created and after doing some backups, and if you change the password, then Velero will not be able to access the repo anymore. So that will lead to trouble. So the recommended practice is install Velero and then immediately change this repo password. Now, let's just talk about how exactly Velero reads the data. That's the important point about file system backup. How does Velero read data? I mean, how does Copia Restic, right, read the data from the PV? And the answer is the data is read from the live PV. And what do I mean by live PV? This is the same persistent volume that your application is using, is accessing while the backup is actually going on. So there is no separate snapshot or there's no separate PV. It's the same live PV that application is using. And for that reason, if application is active, if application is modifying these files in the PV, your backup may not be consistent, right? In fact, most probably it will be inconsistent, the data. So for that reason, this is a big drawback of the file system backup. And so for this reason, you should use Velero hooks. And again, these are Velero hooks give you a chance to run some commands before backups are done. And you should use that to quiz the application and the disk writes. For example, you can flush the writes. You can, a lot of applications like MySQL and Postgres, for example, they do support what is known as a backup mode, right? That they will reduce the writes in some sense. They will flush the writes to the disk. So you should really use the Velero hooks to do that. And if you don't, and if the application is active, your file system backup data in the object store is going to be inconsistent, and you may run into some kind of problem when you do the restore with the consistency, right? So it's very, very important to understand that data is read from the live PV. And for a very long time, this is the only backup type that Velero supported where the data transfer is done. And that has a big drawback, right? But in 1.12, that problem is addressed, and I want to talk about that now. But before I get to that, again, I'll quickly go back and show the backup that I have for the file system backup. So I have the FS backup, and I will show how do you create the file system backup. And this is how you do it. You pass the option. This is how I do it. I pass the option default volume to FS backup true, right? So if you pass this option to the backup create command, that means that it's a file system backup. So Velero is going to do the file system backup. And let's check what does details show us here. And here you can clearly see that Copia backup's completed, and you're seeing all the volumes that are included in the file system backup, right? I use it Copia. So that's what you will see in the backup descriptive details. Now let's move on to the last backup type, and probably the most important one. This is very new. It is introduced in Velero 1.12, which means it's barely 2 months old. It's very similar to FSB, but they address the big drawback that I have talked about in case of file system backups, which is reading from the live PVs, right? But other than that, the rest of the backup functionality, the way the data is transferred to object store using the backup repos, everything, all of that remains same, right? It's done exactly the same way as the case with FSB. The main difference is instead of reading from the live persistent volume, this backup actually creates a CSI snapshot and uses that snapshot as the source for the backup. And in fact, that is the right way to do it. And I would also mention at this point that Cloud Casa has done this has been doing this for 3 years now. Even at the very beginning, when we built Cloud Casa, this is what we have done. Basically, we do a snapshot and we back up from the snapshot. And the reason for us doing that right away is we are a backup company. We have been in backup business for 30 years now. We have other products. So we understand the right way to do the backup, and the right way to backup volume or a file system is to read from a snapshot. So that's why we went ahead and did this very early on. And so we built a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience in this area. Even though Velero only introduced this 2 months back, Cloud Casa as a team, we have a lot of experience with this type of the backup. And how is this implemented? So Velero creates a CSS snapshot of a persistent volume, and then it'll immediately create a temporary PVC with this snapshot as a source. And for those of you who understand how this works, you create a PVC and you set a field called data source, and you point to the CSS snapshot, and then you're getting a temporary PVC right from that snapshot. And Velero will go ahead and back up that PVC using Copia. By the way, only Copia is supported in this type of the backup. So once the PVC is backed up, the temporary PVC is removed, right? Which means the snapshot is removed as well. So cleanup is done. So that is roughly the high-level flow, how it works. I'm calling this SDMB. Again, a quick point, the name is not really, there's no consensus on what to call this. Some people refer to it snapshot data mover backups, and that's usually what I do. There are 1 or 2 other names that people use. And in fact, there is an active discussion in Velero forums what standard name we should use. And I just decided to use this acronym SDMB, which I mean snapshot data mover backups, right? And this is how they work. And what is the advantage? And we already talked about this. The biggest advantage is you're taking a snapshot and you're backing up the snapshot. So automatically your backup is going to be much more consistent. Again, it's not going to be 100% consistent, but it's relatively more consistent because the window is much smaller now. The snapshot typically takes only a few minutes, even shorter than that in most cases. So your data is going to be consistent, but it is still a good idea to use the hooks like I talked about in case of FSB to quiz and freeze the activity on the PV, right? It's always a good idea to get an application consistent backup, and you won't get application consistent backup unless you use these hooks to do something and to freeze the application rights, right? So I highly recommend that even if you use this backup type, you should use application hooks. Without that, you are only going to get what is called crash consistent backups, which is much better than what you get with FSB, but still you should aim for application consistent backups. And there are some limitations with this backup. For example, because this takes a CSS snapshot, obviously you need to, this only works for the CSI PVs. And not only that, your CSI driver must support snapshots and also restore from snapshot. As you will see, that's not always the case. So not all CSI drivers are created equal. So I'll talk about that. So that is required, and only Copia is supported. So you will not be able to use Restic with this flow. And again, this is because Velero maintainers, Velero development team has decided that going forward, all the effort is going to be put on Copia and not on Restic, right? I do have a backup. And this is the SDM backup here. So here, let's see, details. So here, I don't see any extra information provided, like snapshot data mover backups. I brought this up in Velero forums, and work is currently ongoing to give that information. In fact, the work is to include much more descriptive information about each PVC in the backup. So once that is done, most probably in 1.13 timeframe, you are going to see more information in the backup describe about what type of backup is used for a given persistent volume. Right now, comparison between these two, my recommendation, you should use the snapshot data mover backups. There is a typo here, so it should be SDMB. So snapshot data mover backups. Wherever you can, if you basically fulfill the requirements, that's what your first target should be. But if you can't, for whatever reason, you use non-CSI PVs, your CSI driver doesn't support some of this functionality like snapshots, or you want to use Restic for some reason, the next best thing is to use the file system backup, right? I want to take this opportunity to briefly talk about the CSS snapshots. And like I said, we built a lot of experience in this area. We see all the same set of problems arise time and time again. Not all CSS drivers are created equal. I already talked about this. For example, if you take the EFS CSI driver, it is a CSI driver, it supports CSI back interface, but they don't support snapshots. So you can't create CSI snapshots for EFS. So your only option there is to use file system backup. And going one step further, some CSI drivers do support snapshots, but they don't support restore from snapshot. It sounds weird, I know, but that is true. For example, if you take the Azure files, you can take a CSI snapshot, but you cannot use the CSI interface to restore. You might ask, what's the point of the snapshot? In this case, you actually have to use Azure files APIs, right, outside the CSI to do the restore. In fact, Cloud Casa has done that, has implemented that workaround, but Velero won't be able to work with the Azure files. So you have to use the file system backups for that. But Cloud Casa has implemented the workaround for Azure files. So we do work in that case. Even going further, there are some other subtle aspects that you really need to understand. For example, take the case of Longhorn. You can create Longhorn CSI driver does support snapshot creation. You can restore the snapshot you can restore from snapshot, but when you do the restore, the Longhorn CSI driver is actually copying the data from the snapshot to the new volume just created, which means that it's going to take time. The new PV is not going to be ready. And if you have a lot of data, if you're talking about big data, copy is going to take time. The PV is not going to be ready for long duration, and that is going to result in errors. For example, Velero is going to time out saying, I'm trying to create a temporary PVC, it's not ready in time, so it will just mark it as failure. So you need to be really aware of all these subtle aspects for various CSI drivers. So it's not just enough to say that a particular PV has a CSI interface. So you need to understand, does it support snapshots? Does it support restore from snapshots? Even when they do support, is there like an instantaneous operation, or does it include data transfer? So this is more common than you think. And finally, I want to again touch on a few things that I see from time to time in the Velero Slack. So I thought maybe this is a good time to talk about them. When you define a backup, you can, like I said, you can select specific resource types. And what happens is that people want to do the backup of PV and PVCs. So they will say, I want to include PV and PVC. And then they will notice that Velero hasn't done file system backup or the other backup, right? And that's a frequent question in the Velero Slack. And the answer is that you must include parts in the resource type. The reason is the Velero backs up PVCs in the context of the parts. Unless PVCs are mounted or attached to a pod, Velero will not be able to read from those PVs. And for that reason, unless you include parts in the resource types, you are not going to see the file system backups. So it's important, if you are going to select resource types, make sure parts are included if you want to back up PVs, right? And for the same reason, if there are PVCs in the cluster which are not attached to any pod, you will not be able to do the file system backup or the snapshot data mover backup with them, right? It won't work. Snapshots will still work, but the other but this should be really uncommon, right? More in majority of cases, PVCs should be associated with some part. With Longhorn CSI driver, with Longhorn version 1.3 onwards, you need to set this parameter called type snap in the volume snapshot class. So if you don't set it, what happens is when you create the snapshot, Longhorn will try to actually move the data, which is not really a snapshot, right? But that is what it does if you don't use this type snap parameter in the volume snapshot class. Again, we see this from time to time. People will ask, I'm trying to take the snapshot, but it's not working and it's timing out, right? What is going on? And what is going on is that Longhorn is trying to copy the data behind the scenes. Many people may not even set up that object store, so copy won't succeed, and Velero will time out after 10 minutes. So you must use this parameter in Longhorn volume snapshot class. And again, like I mentioned, you should change the global recall password as soon as you install Velero. So you should include it as an immediate step after Velero. And finally, for all file system snapshot data mover backups, stick with the default, use Copia, because that is where the most new functionality is going to happen. Restic is, for all practical purposes, you won't see any new functionality being added on that code path. So in conclusion, I just want to point out, again, reiterate that snapshots are not backups. You should have other strategies in addition to snapshots for your backups, which is either file system backup or snapshot data mode backups, right? So wherever you can, use the snapshot data mode backups. And if you cannot, for whatever reason, then fall back to file system backups. That concludes my presentation. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer at this point.
Yes, exactly. Now it's the perfect time to ask questions if you have any. Sadly, I don't see anything for now, but don't worry. You can always reply to our webinar email invite or go to our website, cloudcasa.io, and contact directly our experts, Raghu, Devarakonda, Bob, at anytime you want. And keep in mind, this is just the beginning. I hope that I'm going to see you soon for the next session based on your ideas, hopefully. So I think that we can do something awesome together. Today's webinar has been a powerful journey through Velero's diverse backup capabilities. Thank you very much, Raghu.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.